then I think you're totally right on let's stop the fighting and just bring everyone together.
The end users won't be interacting directly with the ag layer.
And I actually think that's like the wrong perspective. You got to think about it from a liquidity and users perspective.
People tend to forget that's on Polygon POS.
Welcome back to the Rollup, your home for technical talks and open conversations that shape the modular future. Nothing on today's show is to be construed as financial advice. You can see our full disclosures list at therollup.co/ventures. Sit back, relax, and enjoy today's episode after a quick word from some of our awesome partners.
Redstone modular oracles are available on 50 plus chains, trusted by over 100 clients, and over 6 billion in total value secured. Visit redstone.finance to find out more. Marc, welcome to Bangkok. It's an absolute pleasure to host you on the podcast. We were talking about before we got rolling here, we've covered what feels like every inch of Polygon, but you guys are so expansive that it is continuously evolving and growing, and so it feels like there's always something happening. Obviously the vibes have changed a lot over even the last 2 weeks, but with respect to Polygon specifically, and this evolution from a POS chain to the ZK EVM and the CDK, and now all of these parts combined, how have the vibes evolved? What's kind of the vibes at Polygon now?
Yeah. So thanks for having me first. Pumped to be here. So look, I think if you go back a few years, what everyone remembers is a little bit of, actually if you go far enough back, what you remember is farming Matic on Aave.
Yes.
That was Polygon. And people forget this. That was Polygon. And those were some fun days.
Yes, that was DeFi summer.
It was DeFi summer, and it pretty much, Compounds kicked it off in fairness, but this really elevated it. And then we kind of turned into hey, let's go bring in mass adoption. Mm-hmm. And honestly, that turned us into kind of a little bit of a stodgy, kind of boring crypto company that was not so much fun. And so my mission over the last year and a half has been let's bring fun back to Polygon, and let's do it in a totally crypto native way. And so that's why what you see is a movement of us that's much less focused on the enterprise world and focused on let's actually just bring fun and frankly what people are interested in crypto back. And so that's the direction that you'll see. And one big part of this has been honestly, frankly, part of how we've been branding stuff. We have some fun videos that come out once in a while that people like to have fun with. But I think the more kind of interesting part is there's this cultural shift.
Yeah.
But then there's also a shift from a product perspective that you said, right? We go from POS to ZK EVM, and if you were to ask people at Polygon what do we do now? We focus on cross-chain settlement, and specifically the AggLayer. And then people get confused and they're why do you have POS and ZK EVM, right? And the answer is there's a lot of value built up in POS. It is an actual amazing chain. People do not give it the credit that it deserves.
Polymarket. I'm gonna move this just a bit closer to you.
Yeah.
But Polymarket on POS and is the most widely, just a massive amount of attention on Polymarket in the last months, and one of the few product applications that has found product market fit. People tend to forget that's on Polygon POS.
Yep, exactly. And and we saw on the night of the elections, and when that market was settled, it settled pretty much with no issues whatsoever, right? And that's not that easy to do when I can't remember what the number is, but it's a massive number of users came onto that chain and were participating. So it was good to see, and it's what POS deserves, right? But when we think about that, that's just one part of what we do. And given the focus on the AggLayer, we kind of think of it as a little POS feeds the rest of the AggLayer. It's still got a lot of TVL, a lot of liquidity, and it's got a boatload of users. So when people think about interoperability, we usually think about it purely from a liquidity perspective. And I actually think that's the wrong perspective. You got to think about it from a liquidity and users perspective, right? And so when you think about it, you're really sharing users. If you've got liquidity on one chain, you get to borrow users from another chain that can interoperate with it, and same vice versa from a liquidity perspective. So when you think of POS, you've basically got a chain when it comes into the AggLayer that has a boatload of users.
Yeah.
It also has quite a bit of liquidity, but a boatload of users, and real users who are interacting with real applications like Polymarket. And so that's kind of one of the reasons why POS is such a value add to the AggLayer. And similarly, ZK EVM, one of the things that's not well known now is that we're going to be relaunching ZK EVM, and it's going to be a very DeFi focused chain. And the thought process here is like, if you've got an aggregated network, you want to bring liquidity. And ideally, you actually don't want liquidity split across all of these networks. Aggregate it in one chain and let every network use it. And so we're going to aggregate a boatload of liquidity in a chain.
Yeah. I mean, that's super exciting. I mean, we have ZK EVM, and I think it's still kind of amorphous, and like, you know, people aren't really sure like what it's going to turn into, and you know, to hear that it's going to be a much more targeted, focused chain dedicated to DeFi, I think is very, very exciting because it sets the tone for that chain. And we've seen app chains launch, we've seen, you know, Unichain and all, you know, some of these other ones, but ultimately the trend in which we're going is towards this very targeted, very specific use case per chain. It can still be an ecosystem, but we're moving away from general purpose. We're moving much more into targeted roll-ups for a specific use case. Another part of this is kind of what you alluded to. It's like, you know, with Polymarket's success on Polygon POS, plugging that into the AggLayer is net new users and liquidity for the entire ecosystem. And this is something that we're starting to think quite a bit more about on the rollup, is less infighting. And frankly, the vibes and the green candles have made this a lot easier, because like when things aren't as fun and lighthearted, like there is a lot of infighting and competition amongst rollup clusters for users and liquidity. But once we see kind of that flow in, you know, then it's like, okay, now we can still solve the same problems, same interoperability problems, but now it's like, okay, you know, Optimism brings in a new user, or Polymarket on Polygon brings in a new user. Like that is going to have liquidity knock-on effects for the entire ecosystem. And so there's no more like trying to steal other rollups users. It's like, how can we generally build the best ecosystem, the best experience, so that we can get normies in, and then ultimately like we have more people on chain.
Yeah, I'm like very passionate about this point, because I think like, and you can see this actually in the way that the AggLayer has been handled. So like, we are a contributor to the AggLayer, but like very much you will not see Polygon branding on the AggLayer. And this is like very intentional, because like if it's Polygons, like Arbitrum doesn't want to be part of it, Optimum doesn't want to be part of it, like Scroll doesn't want to be part of it. And it's being built in a way that is like truly neutral to like the entire ecosystem. And I don't, honestly, not just Ethereum, right? All of Web3. We want everyone to be able to be part of it. And so to me, like, we've been trying to like break down these barriers, and honestly we have really good conversations with like most teams. There's only a few that like are harder to get in, but like the idea with the AggLayer is like just build a fundamental kind of like low level framework and then plug things on top of them, right? So like we don't need to compete with shared sequencers. We don't need to compete with like intent, right? Like roll-up clusters that want to exist within the AggLayer, they can exist within the AggLayer. And it's really intended to like bring everyone together. And I think with time, people are going to see that we're very serious about that. Yeah. And part of that's going to start with the fact that like in about 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks from now, we'll be able to add any EVM chain to the AggLayer. And so you'll start seeing OP stack chains connecting to the AggLayer, Orbit chains connecting to the AggLayer, Polygon CDK chains connecting to the AggLayer. But like frankly, we don't care if it's a Polygon CDK chain or an OP stack chain, like just connect to the AggLayer. And then what you'll see a few months after that is you'll actually start seeing L1s connecting to the AggLayer. Non-EVM L1s connecting to the AggLayer. The entire point is like just bring together L3. Because like as big as the Ethereum ecosystem is, and as much as we love the Ethereum ecosystem, it's not like there's not a lot of users elsewhere. Like Solana has a lot of users. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Why not make it easy to bring them to Ethereum? Solana now has a lot of assets. Mm-hmm. Let's bring those assets into Ethereum. Like, why not? Yeah. And so that's really like our perspective, and I think you're totally right on like let's stop the fighting and just bring everyone together.
Yeah, and I think we've all seen these memes where it's like, you know, we have 14 standards. Well, what do we need? We need a standard to standardize the standards, and so now we got 15 standards. And I was having this conversation on a Twitter space with Hart Lambert, who's kind of pushing from across and pushing this cross-chain intent framework. And one of the questions I posed to him was like, hey, you know, we actually had Polygon on, like the Polygon main account was on this Twitter space, kind of showing support as well. And I was like, hey, it's kind of weird, like Polygon's on this Twitter space, they're doing AggLayer, but we're pushing this intense thing. Something is not really adding up here. Like, where's the riff here? But actually, what I learned was that no, these two interop standards are synergistic with one another. AggLayer can verify the transfer onto the destination chain via its ZK proving and its aggregation of proofs. And so one thing that we need to do in kind of like a cross-chain intense world is verify that there was money that was received on the destination chain. What can AggLayer do? Well, it can do verifications really freaking well because it has ZK proofs like baked in, like directly in. And so what I think we're starting to see is like asynchronous, synchronous, intense, into all of these interop solutions are starting to converge and synergistically work with one another. Again, just like super exciting for a unified Ethereum and beyond ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think on like the intense part, I think this is really interesting because people like, this is like an area that like people know and they don't really fully understand. They kind of understand it, but like the AggLayer is not going to be the user-facing thing. Like realistically, like intense is what everybody is going to end up using, probably. And so like users will be facing, across. They will not be facing the AggLayer. But the reason we work with like across, for example, is what across is doing is they need solvers on different networks, which means they need capital on different networks. And having capital available all the time is expensive. You also, when you have a trade executed, you now need to rebalance that capital. The longer it takes to rebalance the capital, the more capital you need in the system in general. On top of that, you're actually taking a risk when you're using solvers. Like you actually have a risk on each of these chains. And so when you use the AggLayer, the cool thing is you reduce these capital costs massively because now you can go back, even though you get like the near synchronous transactions using Intense, you can move back asynchronously within seconds using the AggLayer and rebalance your capital. And you don't need to go via an L1. And so in that sense, basically what does that do? It just lowers user costs and it lowers risks for the intent providers and the solvers. That lowers their risk, they're willing to lower their costs. And so basically what you're doing is via the AggLayer, which is not user facing, you're basically just creating better costs for the users because the intents can be done more cheaply and with less risk.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm kind of zooming out here, like, we still have these roll-up clusters, we're working to align them and create these interop channels between them. How do you think some of the incentives will, kind of like the incentive landscape and the dynamics between these clusters could change after we have proper interop amongst these different clusters?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. I think there is realistically this part right now where we're trying to figure out where everybody fits in, right? Like, I think the first thing people do is they just assume everything's competitive. And they're like, I need to fight everybody, right? And so now you see basically all interop solutions in some way fighting each other. But then if you really dig in and start looking at how things are being built, there's very different approaches being taken, right? And so I do think there's going to be a world in which you're going to have clusters, but I think those clusters are going to look super different than they do today. Right now we have a world of I'll call them asynchronous clusters, right? Like the elastic chain, super chain, right? These are they're not actually operating in a synchronous manner. That doesn't really make sense to have that kind of asynchronous transaction within these clusters. You can have the same asynchronous experience within all of the clusters, and so that shouldn't exist. Realistically, I think one of them needs to reach scale. And this includes the AggLayer, so that the others just say, well, it doesn't make sense for us to have this small portion over here. What they should instead do is turned into I'll call them synchronous clusters through shared sequencers, for example, right? You can envision a world where there's a group of chains who say, hey, we're all open to using the exact same framework. And Superchain works this way. They're hey, you can't have sovereignty. Opposite of the AggLayer approach. Another reason why they're actually compatible, which is you can have a superchain world where you're hey, we're all using the same shared sequencer, and so we can get synchronous transactions within the superchain world. But two things. A, you can get added security by having the AggLayer part of that. Second, for asynchronous transactions, whether it's within the superchain or going outside the superchain, you can use the AggLayer for some asynchronous transactions. But ultimately, I don't think anyone's going to accept that because they're basically saying, hey, I think I'm competitive with you, and we can't do that. And there's a world in which we do. Realistically, you look at the elastic chain, and then you look at the AggLayer, very similar designs. There's no doubt that those two things are competitive. I think when I look at like something like Superchain or like Orbit clusters, like they're actually not competitive with the AggLayer. Teams are treating them as competitive. They're not. And so I think once one of them becomes big enough, that'll change. And that's part of the reason why the AggLayer is not just a Polygon thing. That's not good enough. We need something that brings together all of Web3, not even just all of Ethereum, all of Web3, and that is then going to create enough interest for everybody to come join it. And you've got a standard that people can use, and it's a low-level standard that's not rent-seeking in any way. It's neutral, it's not polygons. There's a bunch of contributors. I think we're probably at like 30 contributors now on the AggLayer. And you end up in like a much better spot than these competing clusters that shouldn't even be competing as asynchronous clusters.
And to your point, I think not all clusters are the same. And so we have some of these clusters that are out there, right? But some of them are ZK, some of them are optimistic, some exist on shared sequencers, some are building their own interop solutions, others aren't. And so we're going to continue to see these clusters, but I do think that some combination of AggLayer and intent is the leading solution to connect these clusters together. And so I'm really, really stoked to see how that plays out inter-cluster. Another kind of like angle to this is, as we connect more and more chains and clusters to the AggLayer, and if you can't answer this, I understand, we'll take it out, but I'm curious what kind of network effects this will have on the POL token and on Polygon as like its cluster, right? As its business. Like, so yeah, how do AggLayer network effects impact the token?
Yeah. The honest answer is we're still figuring it out.
Okay.
The way that we look at it is like the AggLayer needs to be not rent-seeking, but more of a pay-as-you-go model. So if you really think about it, like what is the AggLayer consuming? What it's consuming is proofs, some group of proofs, which actually is like thousands and thousands of transactions in each proof. And so the world that I envision is that in some number of years, the AggLayer is going to start charging some fee. And that fee presumably would flow through to pool holders as the AggLayer gets decentralized, and you need to pay out folks who are actually running this decentralized network. Until that time, there's really no reason to have like any meaningful fees. Even when you do, the way that we think about it is like a very small fee, like 0.0000001 of a transaction, because it's thousands of transactions in a proof,
right.
That is actually being charged per transaction, and you would probably charge it per like batch of transactions, like a proof. And when it gets settled, the AggLayer there's a fee. In that world, you have like a very low level framework, has almost no impact on fees. When it's a standard that all of Web3 is using, it'll add up to be like meaningful enough. Is it going to have $1 trillion valuation? Probably not. Is it going to have many $1 billion valuation? Yeah, it's going to look pretty darn good. And so that's kind of like how we think about it, and that's going to flow through to pool holders as the AggLayer is decentralized.
Yeah, and I think this goes to show like these are the bigger picture dreams and goals that this industry has. Is we're not building for high fee rent seeking in the short term with the set of users that we have on chain now. We're thinking 5, 10, 20 years into the future about these economies of scale, the set of users, the set of liquidity that we're going to have on chain. Then we'll start to think about collecting fees.
I mean, we're going to have millions of chains, like
Yeah.
literally fast forward. I mean,
yeah. So
yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I guess this changes from business model and incentives a little bit, but like in that paradigm where there's millions of chains, how does AggLayer reach all those chains? How extensible is the AggLayer interop solution?
Safe is moving the world's GDP on-chain. With the introduction of SafeNet, Safe is taking this to the next step very soon. Check out net.safe.global to learn more about how Safe is moving the world's GDP on-chain.
Welcome aboard on our journey into the singularity. This is the endgame roadmap for Frax and Fractal, the new L2 out of the Frax ecosystem that is totally based on fractal scaling. Fractal is a modular L2 blockchain built by Frax with modular and fractal scaling in mind. Fractal scaling is based on the Mandelbrot set of fractal images, and it explains how L2s become L3s and the entire app chain lifecycle goes through its evolution. The Frax ecosystem is made of some of the top builders in the space and has stemmed from its OG days of the Frax stablecoin. It is now in the LST space, the LRT space, and this Fraxtal L2 joins the existing suite of Frax products, including Frax Swap and Frax Lend. You can see Frax Ferry, the bridge to go from any chain, Arbitrum, Optimism, or Mainnet into the Fraxtal Mainnet. Bridge your tokens and bring your Frax assets into the Fraxtal ecosystem. Join today to get the best out of Fraxtal. You are still early. Join today. Take part in our expedition into the singularity.
Yeah, I mean, the AggLayer is, so there's a few things. So maybe 2 points that are interesting. The first point that I'll say is the AggLayer does not require anyone to agree to it. You will see us connecting the AggLayer to chains who do not ask for it.
Okay.
And so you will see most big chains connected to the AggLayer by the end of next year.
Guess what? You're aggregated.
You are aggregated and you don't get to choose. And so that's the first thing, is like, we are actually in control of that and don't need to wait for others. But I think on the other end of that, it really comes down to like network effects. Is at a certain point, what we're going to see is everybody saying, hey, I'm going to spin up a chain. I don't want to be on my island. Okay, we already see that. And then they say, which island do I want to be on? And they say, I want to be on the biggest island. And that island just continues to grow. And nobody's going to launch a chain like on its own. It just won't make sense. And so I think in the end, you have everything congregate around one just because of the network effects.
Yeah. I mean, and so that I think makes sense from a business perspective. We're going to absolutely see shelling points start to emerge. And I think we're already seeing that. And AggLayer is in a position to be one of them. Technically, how is that possible? Like, what is the scale at which AggLayer can run?
Yeah. So a few things. So first, it's a question of how do we connect chains, right? And our original thinking, like when we like a year ago was thinking about the AggLayer, was like, okay, let's connect chains that only use execution proofs. Problem with that being, like, honestly, not that many chains use execution proofs today. It's a very small market. Like, bad idea. And so we expanded and we started saying, okay, how do we connect any chain? And like the way we think about it right now is like, we can take an AWS like server and we can connect it to the AggLayer without any risk. And the reason for that is basically what we refer to as like the pessimistic proof. And effectively what this is a proof that tracks every chain and says, what is the balance on this chain? It basically looks at how many tokens have come in, how many have left, and basically calculates that. And every time there's a cross-chain transaction, it looks at like, hey, do you actually have those funds on there? And it doesn't matter whether you have execution proofs or not. So like Cosmos chains, or Polygon POS is a great example of this. When we first connect Polygon POS to the AggLayer, we're actually going to connect it through what we refer to as proof of consensus. We're just going to prove the POS consensus, because there are no execution proofs on it yet. And via that proof, we're going to feel comfortable that the token balances that are there and wanting to be transferred can actually be transferred. And so that's like kind of like the idea. But when you start wanting to scale that even bigger, you start needing like probably one very important thing, which is just toolkits that make it incredibly easy to connect to any type of chain. And so that's basically what we're developing. What we're developing is like, hey, like an SVM toolkit, for example. Now it's simple to connect the AggLayer to like any SVM chain. Every RAS provider that says, hey, here's like a SVM-based rollup can connect them to the AggLayer. Same thing for Cosmos chains and so on and so forth. Obviously, like EVM chains were pretty much there. And so that's going to make it really easy to connect. And then the second part is really like the throughput of the AggLayer. Big part here is going to be like the proof aggregation aspect of this, and provers having lower latency and lower cost with time. And basically, like, we just see cost and latency of provers just dropping like this incredibly fast. We're very close to that. We know how it works, and like in a very short period of time, we're going to be able to have like millions and millions of transactions at incredibly low cost, and latencies just continue to drop even further. And that's how we're going to get to the point where you can easily connect all of these chains, and then you can easily execute transactions across all these chains easily.
Got it. And yeah, I appreciate the technical kind of unpacking there. Now, a little bit higher level, but you mentioned that AggLayer is it consumes proofs, right? And I think that's pretty well understood. And so that is actually the back end for a lot of these systems. The end users won't be interacting directly with the AggLayer. So maybe you could kind of fill that gap, right? Where AggLayer lives down here and users are interacting with something up here. Like, what are the end users interacting with? And then could you kind of cross that chasm for us?
This is a really good question. I love this one. Okay, so maybe let's baseline on the AggLayer, because I think there's actually, notwithstanding that we've talked about it a lot, there's still a lot of confusion. Mm-hmm. So the AggLayer is multiple components. It's a bridge. And most people think of it as just a bridge, but it's not. It's got a bridge. It's this unified bridge. Second thing that it has is this pessimistic proof. Right. That's what provides the security that you get from the AggLayer. The third one is proof aggregation. This is the thing that people think creates the interoperability, but it doesn't. Proof aggregation is the thing that actually lowers the costs by wrapping proofs and wrapping proofs and wrapping proofs, and then submitting proofs more infrequently to Ethereum. But once you actually start having enough chains, because you're amortizing the cost across so many chains, you can actually start submitting those proofs to Ethereum very quickly, but with so many transactions that the costs are incredibly low. And so you're effectively lowering ultimate finality on the AggLayer on Ethereum in that way.
And so you're doing that by raising the priority fee on sort of the bundles that you're pushing to Ethereum. You're kind of saying, hey, we'll pay quite a bit to get this included quickly, and you can pay quite a bit because if you have 1 million rollups, you amortize the quite a bit cost over quite a bit of chains, and it becomes relatively cheap per transaction.
It becomes super cheap per
super
transaction.
Cheap.
Yep. And then the fourth part of kind of the AggLayer is actually what we refer to as fast interop. This is the part that most people kind of miss. They think it's been captured by these other three parts. And the way that we look at that is basically, so we believe the world's going to end up with every chain having execution proofs. I think everybody believes this now. Everyone's going to use ZK proofs across all of crypto. When you get to that world, what you can do is you can take chain A, it creates a proof, and then you can take chain B that creates a proof, and those two chains want to execute a cross-chain transaction. The moment those proofs are created, you can actually execute that cross-chain transaction on the basis of trusting those proofs to be valid, even before they're submitted to Ethereum. And so this is what we're targeting for March is sub 5 seconds. I'm being conservative, we want lower than that. Nice. Transactions, cross-chain, based off of these proofs being able to be trusted. If any one proof doesn't settle to Ethereum, then the entire transaction gets kind of unbundled and doesn't get executed. But generally speaking, in the world of rollups, you can actually be very confident that two proofs that have been created are going to settle to Ethereum, and so you get this super low latency. So with those being the four components of the AggLayer, what you find out there is that effectively what you can get with the AggLayer alone is some user-facing content, right? Theoretically, what you could see is you could say somebody that says, I just want sub 3 second, sub 5 second, whatever we end up getting to, transactions cross-chain. I can just do that directly on the AggLayer. I don't need intents. I don't need anything else. And so I'll just do that directly on the AggLayer. There's other things that we can do cool. For example, we built this library called Bridge and Call. So this one's actually kind of neat because it actually makes the user experience cross-chain better than an L1 itself. We've been super, I think, not very creative in the L1 space. Think of how you execute a transaction. You go to the Aave interface, and you borrow funds. You then take those funds, and then you go and you open up the Uniswap interface. Obviously, by the way, we have alternatives. I'm just giving you an example here, right? And you go ahead and you use those borrowed funds to deposit in a pool. That's actually insane when you think of that. Why isn't it that we're not opening our wallet and saying, I want to borrow funds on Aave and deposit them in a pool in Uniswap, click, you are now approved multiple transactions across chains, and that kind of stuff. This is what the Bridge and Call library does. Now it takes it further because it actually allows you to bridge across Ethereum and in that same transaction, execute multiple transactions across chains. And so you actually end up into a thing that could easily exist on an L1, but doesn't really, where you're executing multiple transactions in basically just one click with a better user experience. So that's another way that we will have wallets. We're working very closely with we just recently announced that Magic Wallet is creating like an AggLayer focused wallet, as well as like a roll up on the AggLayer along with Octo Wallet, which, just side note, download Octo Wallet. I'm not even kidding, go try it. It's like the craziest user experience in all of crypto that nobody knows about. Literally, like, you talk about like chain abstraction, like done. You don't even need to, like, you literally just say, I want to send 10 USDC from this wallet to this wallet, regardless of where you have those funds, done. Now, this gets to like the next layer, right? So like, at this point, what we've talked about is like, okay, the AggLayer can be user-facing, but you're still gonna have like relatively high latency. I mean, 2 seconds is pretty good, but like sometimes you're gonna want like an even better user experience than that. And for example, you're not going to be able to do something like flash loans. And so let's say
and is that because it's synchronous?
Because it's asynchronous.
Oh,
you won't be able to do flash loans because you need to do it in the same block. And so you need some means of doing synchronous transactions. And so that's where you get like one layer above, as I picture it, in like the shared sequencing land, where you start saying like, hey, we actually want synchronous transactions because we care to include multiple transactions in the same block. That's not something the AggLayer can do at all. The AggLayer can add security to that shared sequencer, but it can't actually provide that synchronous transaction, right? And so now you think of that and you're like, okay, that's another layer kind of closer to the user, or equivalent, you could say, when it comes to synchronous transactions. But again, like most of the time, users are going to be interacting with that through something, which will probably be some sort of like wallet or like front end of some sort somewhere. And theoretically, they could be interacting directly with that shared sequencer in that way. But then when you're not using a shared sequencer, you're basically like, okay, I still want a really smooth experience that is really fast, and I'm willing to pay more than what I would pay for like a transaction with the AggLayer, because I really want it to feel like it happens in like less than a second. And that's where like intents start coming into play. And at that point in time, like you can think of the intents as basically having funds on one chain and on another chain, and given that there's funds on both, you can execute that transaction like basically immediately because there's funds on both chains. Again, more expensive. So if you can avoid doing that because you don't need, less than 5 seconds latency or whatever it is, then you would go ahead and you would use that. If you did, or you would use the AggLayer if you don't actually need that. If you do need a fast transaction, then you would just rely on the intents. And so like I kind of like view it as like moving up the stack based on like what you need, but like I think the thing we're just not imagining well enough is like what that holistically looks like. The wallet experience that it might look like we really like, and who's building that out in terms of like, and this is where we're spending like a lot of time. It's like we want the infrastructure that creates the best user experience, the ones who understand how to embed the concept of like the AggLayer itself, shared sequencers, intents, and anything else, and like bring it all together into one. And we just need like, frankly, a lot of people working on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you do a really good job of painting that picture. And I think one thing that we're starting to hear and feel and develop is this app-centric view, where these are the applications are the ones with the distribution to the end user. And we saw that with Polymarket. And so they own that end user relationship, and the reason that they do is because they have the brands that are recognizable and the brands that are trusted by people, and people say, hey, you know what, that sounds cool and that looks cool, I want to go try that, and they log on to the app, right? And so we want to abstract away all of the complexity of the wallet, the interop, all of that is going to end up underneath the hood. Whereas right now, as power users, we're looking at this and we're using it on a day-to-day basis, and we're like, it works. Why do we need chain abstraction? Well, it's not for us. It's for everyone else who we're trying to get into the ecosystem as new users, new sources of liquidity. And
this is, by the way, a really good point, because I say it all the time. I'm like, I don't get a problem with the user experience here. It's fine. And then people are like, what world do you live in? Like, no, it's not. And they're right? Like, it's not. It's because I got so used to this that it's like normal to me to like have to wait and like have a failed transaction sometimes on some chain, or to like actually wait longer so that I don't risk that. And it's like, that's not normal.
Yeah. And so, once I think it is hard to imagine a bit, because it's not something that we're going to see. It's not something that's visual. It's something that's going to live underneath the applications. And so we can think about it, we can have mental models for it, but ultimately end users don't need to really see this because it'll be happening for them underneath the hood. And then things like, AggLayer is something where I think a general theme amongst this conference and just in general that we've seen is that ZK is eating the world. Everything is moving in this direction. It is the end game. ZK is here, and AggLayer is helping to ZKify everything. And so, Ethereum kind of announced their consensus layer sort of proposal, and it's basically to take Ethereum in this ZK direction. And so I'm just generally curious, if you have thoughts on that, if you have general thoughts on ZK, how is AggLayer pushing forward a ZK movement that I think a lot of the Web3 ecosystem is getting behind? Yeah. AggLayer is playing a really significant role in that. And so as you kind of look at the rest of these ZK solutions that are getting built across the ecosystem, how can we take those all into account and use them to power this abstracted app-centric experience that I think all of us can kind of imagine in our head, but we haven't seen in real life yet?
Yeah. I think we're further away than people actually think. And the reason's because the lack of trust that people have in ZK tech, because it's not mature. And by the way, I see this all the time when I'm talking to teams and I'm saying, hey, come build over here. There's execution proofs. Everybody knows it's the future, this and that. And they're like, oh, but it's not as mature as optimistic rollups. And you get this I hear this all the time. And I'm just like, okay, but almost all optimistic rollups have a fraud-proof system that's less than a year old, by the way. Even Arbitrums has a new proof system, right? Optimism literally just launched theirs. They're completely immature, actually. And so I think there's this idea that ZK is not mature enough, and we need to overcome that hump, even though people know it's the future. And then second is this idea that ZK is just too expensive. I mean, we right now can execute on a transaction a proof is going to cost even on our more expensive prover, we're at basically 0.0007 a transaction. It's adds nothing. And so to me, we're already at the point where it's cheap enough, but people have not recognized that. So that's to me the second hump that we need to get over is people recognizing that we are at a point where trust in ZK proofs is high enough, should be high enough. The cost of ZK proofs are high enough that we should start seeing where we can embed them everywhere. And step one to me is just execution proofs on every chain. But if we can't even get there, to me looking at where else we can embed execution proofs, ZK proofs is a big uphill battle. Yeah. And I think it's going to take honestly Arbitrum and Optimism moving to ZK proofs to actually get people to understand that. And the funny thing is again, people forget Polygon's not the same that it was. We literally want to help them, because for us, more chains that have execution proofs, better experience on the AggLayer, we want it. So we've seen OP Succinct, right? This is the OP stack where Succinct brought SP1 on it. Yep. And so you actually have the OP stack that has execution proofs now. We love that, because all we say is hey, you want to use OP stack with execution proofs, you can do that and connect it to the AggLayer. And then same thing will happen eventually with Orbit. And this is just a win for the entire ecosystem. It's good for the AggLayer as well. And so to me, that's the starting point. And then what's really quickly going to happen as well is I think as more chains get connected to the AggLayer, more chains start getting, more transactions start getting executed cross-chain. You start building a huge amount of trust. And so at that point, you start overcoming this idea of it's too expensive and it's not trustworthy when you've got hundreds of chains initially that are going to be executing cross-chain transactions without any problem. And once that confidence gets built up, that's when it snowballs into different areas. Yeah, and that's the Schelling point that we talked about, where there are network effects that start to build, and they're not just technical network effects or incentives that start to accrue. There is an air of confidence that starts to build around these Schelling points. And you mentioned OPSP1 and OP Succinct, and for anyone that's listening, our last podcast that we did with Brendan about AggLayer was with Brendan and Uma, and there's a tight coupling between AggLayer and SP1 as well, and so for anyone, that was a great podcast, and encourage people to check that one out as well. The proofs that we actually use, the pessimistic proof actually uses SP1, which is created using Plonky 3, which is what Polygon created as like the base layer of like most ZK proofs. So it's kind of like, honestly, it's fun to see how open source is so exponential. We've debated that to be like, look, everything we do at Polygon has always been open source. But like, honestly, do we have conversations on like, hey, should everything that we do be open source? Yeah. And we always win out in favor of like, it's the right thing. And like one key thing actually was like Plonky 3. We actually talked about this, was like, hey, like everyone's going to use this. We lose our ZK advantage if everyone uses it. We shouldn't do that. And then the same thing that always happens with all open source, which is we made it open source and it's getting broadly adopted, and frankly, it's just getting better. and provers are just getting better because of it. And it like accelerated the adoption of ZK, which is frankly exactly what we want for the AggLayer in general, and everybody's better off.
Yeah.
And so like the lesson in there is like open source always wins.
Yeah, kudos to you guys for open sourcing that. I mean, generally, if something's a good idea, like it'll get adopted no matter what. And so, you know, you guys put that out there. Awesome. I mean, this has been a blast. Like, I think we've talked about so much, and you know, Polygon sort of sometimes gets critiqued as being like this just can't really put your finger on it. It's like this a conglomeration of a bunch of different stuff. A lot of good stuff, but like maybe you can help just like bring all of this together, help wrap us up. Like, what in a nutshell, like Polygon.
Yeah. Polygon's a core contributor to the AggLayer. We want to grow the AggLayer so that all of Web3 can be as big as the internet in a seamless way. The other way that I put it the other day on like a podcast that like the EF was running was I said something like, our North Star on interoperability, and I was not referring to just Ethereum, but all of Web3, should simply be that you want it to feel like one L1, but scale like millions of L1s. And so that's like ultimately the goal that we have with like the AggLayer. And when you think of everything else that we do, it's just adding to it. POS is adding users to the AggLayer. Polygon ZK EVM will add liquidity to the AggLayer, and then like the thousands of other chains will benefit from all of that. And it's really the easiest way to think of Polygon.
You just got aggregated.
I love it. That was perfect.
Cool. Thanks, man.
Cool.